Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel.
I'm not hearing her, right?
It's a pleasure to be your moderator this afternoon. I know it was a busy day filled with insightful conversations. In this session, we will be discussing with our esteemed panelists the challenges faced by Europe today, the future of transatlantic relations, and Europe's evolving role in the world. As a new America emerges, focused inward and pursuing unilateral strategies, Europe finds itself at a pivotal moment, redefining its role on the global stage. With growing security challenges and a US administration appending long-standing Western alliances, European countries are stepping up investments in defense and military capabilities, but also in technology and infrastructure to assert their influence in an increasingly multipolar world. As these dynamics unfold and more, we will be exploring in today's session the strategic shifts that Europe must undertake to lead in this evolving global order, or shall I say, new order. So we will be discussing these points with our esteemed speakers. We will be dedicating toward the end of the session around 15 minutes for an audience Q&A, during which you are encouraged to ask our panelists any questions you may have. And we will wrap up the session with one closing question for our panelists. In no specific order, Minister Stenengard, I'm going to start with you. The approach of President Donald Trump's administration, especially the America First slogan, has challenged many of the traditional commitments of the US and has heightened European security concerns. With that being said, are we entering a new era for transatlantic relations?
Well, thank you very much. Coming from Sweden, I'm a true transatlantic friend. I believe we have a lot to gain from cooperating closely together. And as friends, I can also say that I believe that in one way, the US is right. In another way, the US is wrong. So the US is right that Europe has not done enough for their own security. We have not spent enough on our own security, but now we're doing our homework. Sweden has gone from, well, we have doubled our expenses in defense in 4 years. Many other European countries are now doing the same. But I would say that what has made Europe successful is what we have to stick to, and that is what will also grow, make our competitiveness grow, and that is free trade. So I believe in trade deals, talking about deals, which is very popular these days, not in tariffs, which are actually taxes. So I truly believe that Europe should go back to basics, continue to be a strong market economy driver in the world, do more deals on trade with countries such as India, and make sure that we all grow stronger. Thank you.
Minister Bettel, what's the view from Luxembourg? How do you see this emerging order, especially that today there's a much anticipated call between President Trump and President Putin?
I prefer the questions you asked Maria. I'm not a fortune teller. And for the moment to tell you what is the outcome of the phone conversation between President Trump and President Putin, nobody knows. For me, what is the most important is that we stay also as European Union, and we were able till now to do it, that there is no decision about Ukraine without Ukraine. It cannot be like President Trump and now President Putin going like in a supermarket, just to take what they want. Or to around the table, on the menu is not Ukraine. Ukraine is sitting around the table and in the kitchen. And so it is important that all decisions that we are going to take and to accept will be taken with the agreement of Ukraine. I had this morning an interview with an Indian public TV broadcaster, and they asked me if I agree, for example, with the position of India or America or that we want peace. We all want peace. But we cannot decide about Ukraine without Ukraine. I wouldn't accept that other countries would decide what is good for me. And so the outcome, for the moment, it is important to have the ceasefire. This is the most important because every day people are still dying. But it has to be with Ukraine. And that's the reason why we want to support Ukraine, because I lived in a situation in the Second World War where a bigger country thought they would know what is good for me. And it was at that moment Americans, Brits, Canadians, and Russians who liberated Europe. And so it's not because we are not neighboring country to Ukraine that we should not take care, because tomorrow it can be someone else. We have international rules and we have to respect international rules, but nothing on Ukraine without Ukraine. It is all with them around the table. And I can tell you, with the scene we've seen in the Oval Office, I don't know a lot. I was prime minister for 10 years, so I know most of the head of states and head of governments in the world. I don't know a lot of head of states who were able, after what happened in the Oval Office, to say, I'm sorry, let's start again. The ego of the politicians usually would be to never do that. And it's the proof that President Zelensky wants to do everything for his country and not for himself.
Speaking of presidents, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Batel. Speaking of president's actions, and actually what has been happening in Ukraine and also recently between the United States or between President Trump and the Ukrainian president, this brings us to a very important topic, which is defense and security in Europe. And Minister Brekelmans, after all these talks about the importance of stepping up, investment in military capabilities and defense, is it time to reconsider a European army with a common standing EU force and a unified command structure?
So I think it's very clear that European countries should do more in terms of our defense. I think it's also clear that we need to work more with coalitions of the willing, because what we have seen over the past few years is that it's very difficult to come to a full agreement with 27 EU countries. So the fact that there's now a group of European countries talking about robust security guarantees, I think that's very good. And we might have a coalition of the willing now that might change over time, because you can have an election outcome which changes the attitude and the position of a country. Take, for example, how Poland has changed after the election. Take the position of the UK. So I think the reality is that we should not work too much when it comes to defense and to the deployment of our armies with 27 countries, because it's very hard to find consensus. I think we are much more effective if we work with groups that are with coalitions of the willing, and coalitions of the willing that can change over time. I think when it comes to the defense industry, which is one of the key challenges, I think there's a lot that we could do on a EU level. We need to make sure that we invest more in our industries, that we invest more in our innovation, and that we invest more in the strategic capabilities that now the United States is doing. And we should create a roadmap together with the United States to, over time, come to a transition in which we take over more of those responsibilities. When it comes to, that's my final point, we have had many discussions in the EU about ramping up our industry. And what I've experienced so far over the last 9 months as a minister, but also before as a member of parliament, is that it's very difficult for individual countries to transcend their national interest and to step over their national interest. So we have many meetings on the EU level and the NATO level, and all the ministers say the right things, that we should aggregate our demand, and that we should standardize, and that we should not buy only our specific equipment. And then the ministers of defense go back to their capitals. They look at the equipment that they need, and then they're going to talk to their own industry on how this can be delivered. And we should stop this, because that's not the most effective way to ramp up our European industry. And I think we should stop talking big words, but we should move towards big actions. And also in this case, it can be easier with a small group of countries, for example, 4 or 5, to say, okay, what type of ammunition do we need? Let's bring this demand together and let's set up some factories or set up some production lines. Same with missiles, same with other goods that are relatively easy. Let's start with this. And then we get to the more advanced equipment later. Because I think we do need results in the short term to show that we are able also to ramp up our defense industry faster than we are doing now. And we need to show that we are able to deliver results and not only make big statements.
These are very important points, but they also bring us to an important question. Is this arms race, Mr. Bellew, is this arms race putting Europe under financial strain, especially amid talks about deficits, national debt? We've seen protests this week. So is this putting Europe under a financial strain?
First, it depends on what you define as financial strain, and that's contingent on how you define your priorities. And I think everyone agrees that this is a huge priority for Europe now. We are speaking about an increase from 1 to 2 points. Do we need the mic?
Please.
Thank you. We are speaking about 1 to 2 points of GDP. So that's not huge in itself, if this is a big priority, which it should be. So it's a little bit, it's like saying somebody's starving and you're saying if eating more food would be put in a financial strain. If he can afford it, he should do it. And I think we should proceed along those lines. And we have to think that, and this goes also for transatlantic links, is that if we want to be credible and useful partners, we need to have our own capabilities, and that's independent of what other actors do, or the US or other actors. So this is something that we should do regardless of the current political makeup in the US. And on the capabilities itself, when you look at the biggest security threat for Europe right now, which is of course Russia, and you see that I was checking before we came into the panel, this is Russia's economy is 10 times smaller than the European Union. So if we, and we are all Europeans around the table, if we are not able, as some of the richest countries in the world, to increase somewhat our military spending to face this threat from this relatively small economy, that means what we have a problem, that we are in dire trouble. This is, even if we spend half of what Russia spends, it will still be 5 times more than Russia is spending on the military. We must not forget also that the military at the most modern, which was at the beginning of the war, their results were quite dismal. So this is not some kind of military juggernaut. This is a geographically big country with a relatively small economy and which is not very efficient at managing its resources. And I completely agree with the Dutch colleague. We need to move forward. This is a matter of urgency. So it's true that at 27, it will be very difficult, not to say impossible. So those countries willing to move forward at a quicker speed must be able to do so, either within the framework of the treaties, which provide for some tools to do this, or elsewhere outside the treaties. But the thing is that we need to step up our efforts very quickly to respond to this threat and also to present something to our allies on the other side of the Atlantic or elsewhere.
Thank you. Minister Vattel, would you like to add any comments on this?
For me, what is important, because we speak very often about figures. It's the fact for the moment when we look Europe, we started with steel and coals. At the beginning, that was the European Union, because we knew that we were not the heavyweight, but good weight, but we need to work together. If we look at the success today of Airbus, Airbus is not a national company, it's a European company. It's Germany, it's Spain, it's France, it's UK. They came together to create Airbus. It would have been a French plane, a German plane, a Swedish plane, a Dutch plane. I don't build planes, so I don't have Luxembourgish planes, but it would have been not the success we have with Airbus when we compare to Boeing today. So maybe we should have also a common industry of defense. Because for the moment when we see the Americans, they have 5 guns, they have 5 helicopters, they have 5 planes. We have 20 guns, 20 helicopters, 20 planes, and the interoperability between the countries is not granted. But on the other hand, it costs much. So it would be maybe an idea instead, because it's difficult now. As the Minister of Defense said, he wants to say, we want to spend. But then at the end of the day, they will see also the return on invest. And so I understand that a Czech Prime Minister preferred that there are, we buy Czech weapons, the Spanish ones, the French ones. And if we have a common project in Europe with some models that we are able to have in common and build in common instead of national industry, but in European industry where we take all the profit, maybe we can have more with less money. But that's not easy. Because everybody wants to say to their voters, we have our industry and we protect our industry. But if we want to have a successful defense industry in Europe, we have to build these national borders and to have common projects. Airbus is the best one. If we wouldn't have Airbus, I think we wouldn't have today a national European country producing planes. And Airbus is a world success because we are able to say, let's do something together.
In this very same context, I'll let Ms. Cope comment on that. We will not be mentioning figures, but a set percentage. I mean, we're not mentioning figures, but there are reports that President Trump might calibrate America's NATO engagement in a way that favors members of the alliance that spend a set percentage of their GDP on defense. This is a major policy shift if it happens. How do you see it?
I think in the entire debate around European defense spending, I mean, the obvious thing, and the minister just said it now, we all know that Europeans, many Europeans, not all of them, but many Europeans have been delinquent and have been delinquent for 15 years in spending, as was agreed to, enough on defense. But what bothers me about the current framing, which makes it all about money, is that it looks like if Europeans now scale spending up, it's because the Americans told them that that would be the condition under which Article 5 actually exists. In reality, I would like Europeans to understand that this is about security. And so for a long time, we thought security is a nice to have. It's a thing we do on top after we've done everything else, welfare and infrastructure and all that. But security is the precondition. Nothing else exists without security. And so even if the tone was more diplomatic, there is a reality that Europeans cannot deny, and that is that the United States could not sustain a two-front war. The United States military could not fight Russia in Europe and China, let's say, in the South China Sea. It's just, from a military point of view, not possible. So if you look behind the rather crude language when it comes to defense spending, even if things were much more polite, Europeans have a critical security vulnerability that's going to get worse over time if we're not acting now. So I think, for me, the most important thing is let's make this not about money. Let's make this not about transactional policies. And instead, as Europeans, face the reality of a security landscape that has changed in the sense that we're not doing this for the United States. We're not doing this for Donald Trump. We're doing this because we have to do it, because otherwise, our states, our societies, our way of life cannot be protected. And I think that's where I would like the conversation to go, because otherwise it just looks like we haven't paid our insurance bills in time. Okay, now finally we're going to do it. We need a real mindset change also in the European publics. And perhaps that's the blessing in disguise of President Trump, is that he forces European publics to accept that this is no longer something you can have, but it's something that you have to have.
But there's a very important point that should be highlighted here, which you mentioned. Article 5 of NATO, the pillar of NATO, is it being undermined now? Is it being undermined by President Trump? I mean, the fact that this principle never had to be invoked during the Cold War is a proof of its deterrent effect. Is it being undermined now?
I mean, every time, well, yes and no. I will say openly questioning whether it still stands is in itself undermining it. But then again, not spending enough on defense to be able to actually sustain Article 5 obligations, that's also undermining it. So I think, without wanting to defend the White House, I think in general, transatlantic commitment relies on both words and and tools. But ultimately, deterrence, I always say deterrence is a language. It's not something you have, it's something you say. I think that NATO, that the deterrent nature of Article 5 still holds, in the sense that I'm convinced that President Putin doesn't think that he can 100% rely on the United States not coming to the defense of Europe. So you have, I mean, it's a false negative in that sense. But of course, I would prefer for none of the allies to question whether you would come to each other's help, as President Trump has done lately.
Minister Stenengard, would you like to add anything here?
I completely agree. I think there is no reason to doubt, and there is nothing that the new American administration has said that points to the direction that they do not stand behind Article 5. I think that many mix up what they're saying about Ukraine as regards their possibility to become members of NATO with their role in NATO, and that should not be mixed up. That's actually two different things. So I consider them as definitely reliable partners behind Article 5.
I'll move now to alliances and geopolitical positioning. Turkish officials have been saying that now is the time for Turkey and Europe to unite and design their own center of gravity. Minister Brekelmans, Turkey was once referred to as Russia's Trojan horse in NATO. Does it look now like a logical partner?
Now, so I think over the last few years, Turkey has played an important role, for example, with the grain agreement and the grain deal when it comes to securing the Black Sea and securing trade routes in the Black Sea. So we have seen that Turkey has been able to play an intermediating role, which has been very important, also for the benefit of Ukraine. And also when it comes, for example, in the exchange of prisoners of war, Turkey has played a role in this. I think at the same time, we've also seen that there has been some support for the Ukrainian side by Turkey. And at this point, when we talk about security guarantees and robust security guarantees, we need to have the major European and the major NATO allies involved. And Turkey can play an important role in this because they have a big land force. And if they are able to deploy some of their troops, I think that can be a very valuable contribution. Second, we have seen in the recent past that Turkey is willing and able to confront Russia as maybe the only NATO ally who has actually done this in the recent past. So also when it comes to deterrence, making sure that Turkey is involved, I think is an invaluable asset. Of course, that doesn't solve all our issues. We have quite a few issues with Turkey on many aspects, but it's more about sometimes about human rights or migration or other issues. But when it comes to their military involvement and their role within NATO, I think it is an important partner. I think they have shown that they are able to play a very important role when it comes to the war of aggression of Russia within Ukraine. And I think when it comes to building robust security guarantees, I think Turkey can play an important role there.
Mr. Beliou, what is Spain's view in this regard? Do Turkey-EU relations need a rethink?
I don't know rethink, but I think they should be significantly strengthened. In the specific case of Spain, we have excellent relations with Turkey. We have a Patriot battery in the eastern part of Turkey, in Incirlik, in the NATO base there. And we engage with them both at prime minister level, foreign minister level, etc. constantly. They're playing also an important role in other files, like, of course, Syria, etc. And we have those close relations. So I would say they've also changed their approach recently. And for instance, I was quite surprised to find that they were presenting a common candidacy with Greece for the OEC package of appointments. So they've taken a more constructive approach. We should do the same. We should engage with them in the matter of Ukraine. And I would say there are two flank powers, if I may say so, in Europe, which is Turkey and the UK. Both are big countries. They're about the same size in population-wise. They're both important military powers. and they're both, let's say, at the entrance of the Black Sea, and then at the entrance of the Baltic Sea, which are two places where Russian vessels are likely to be present at some point. And I think we should, with both, engage more deeply in defense and other topics. On Turkey, Spain also supports the accession of Turkey to the European Union, following, of course, the merit-based approach.
Also,
It's not working.
okay. Also on alliances, a majority of EU member states are advocating for deeper security cooperation with the UK. Ms. Go, do you think the EU needs to broaden its security umbrella to include the UK and perhaps southern neighbors as well?
As a NATO person for NATO, I'm personally not convinced that the EU is the right umbrella for that. Maybe it's also not NATO. Maybe it's something else altogether, where you have the UK, you have Norway, of course, inside, in addition to Europeans, to other Europeans. But also, you could imagine what NATO calls at the moment partners around the globe, or its partners in general, actually. So it could range from Japan to Australia, New Zealand, and to North Africa, if you want to. So I think if you wanted, so there's multiple models, I think, at the moment you can play with, right? So you can either come up with an alternative, including partners from around the world, or you could also imagine a strengthening of the European pillar within NATO. Something people often forget, if you're not familiar with history, is that before NATO was created, for the United States to get involved in NATO, a precondition was that the Europeans get their act together and find a common agreement not to go to war with each other before the United States come in. So that was then the Brussels Treaty, the WEU, the Western European Union, which was essentially the European pillar of NATO. It was integrated into the EU about 15 years ago, but I think it's totally imaginable that you go back to a structure that does not undermine NATO, but that coexists within NATO, but also pays tribute, a little what we just heard, coalition of the willing, pays tribute to the fact that there are certain states that do perceive the security situation in a certain way, and others that do not. So it's about a car with several gears. You don't have to run all in the same way. So I think it's time to be creative. As I said, NATO is already engaged with many partners around the globe in the format that's called Partners Around the Globe, but also Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, Mediterranean Dialogue, Partnership for Peace. Because I think the alternative will be inaction. And I think we can do everything, but not do nothing.
Minister Brekelmans, would you like to add anything on this point?
And I agree. I think what we desperately need, of course, if the United States is less involved, is strategic capabilities. And we know that the United Kingdom can play an important role in this. I'm very happy that they are now also taking a leading role together with France in creating security guarantees and thinking about European engagement inside Ukraine. I still think when it comes to this later point, still a lot of questions need to be answered. So, of course, it's about the military planning, but we also need to be very clear about what any military force then is going to do. What is the task going to be? What is the mandate? What happens if Russia is violating any peace agreement? Who's then deciding how this military force is going to react or not? Those are some very fundamental questions that still need to be answered. I think it's helpful that the United Kingdom is on board because they can also have the capacity, the strategic capacity, together with France to think about these questions and to make sure that we have them defined very sharply before we decide on any military engagement. And finally, one other thing that we need to make sure is that we do not only think about a potential European force in Ukraine, but also define more clearly what type of monitoring mission we want to set up. Because that's something, I think, a key piece of the puzzle that's sometimes forgotten. We need to have something like an independent body which is able to define whether a peace agreement has been violated or not. And we have some very bad experience in the past, or let's say some mixed experience in the past, when it comes to, for example, the role of the OSCE and how they have been able, after the Minsk agreement, to do that. So I think we need to have the United Kingdom on board purely for their military power, but also for their global outlook and for their strategic capacity to make sure that we, as European countries, are able to get to clear answers on these fundamental questions.
Thank you. I'll move to our last segment, which is Europe's economic and global influence, before engaging the audience. So please, if you have any questions for our panelists, you are encouraged to head to the microphones here in the room. Minister Stengaard, while the priority shifts towards defense and security, several European countries, including Sweden, have announced cuts to their foreign aid budgets. Where does this leave global aid efforts?
Well, to begin with, Sweden is still a champion regarding development aid. We spend 0.7% of our GDP on development aid. And it's not only because it's the right thing to do, it's because it truly makes a difference. It makes a difference to prevent forced migration, to prevent extremism, to promote women's and girls' rights, and to fight HIV. So this is also in Sweden's very interest, and also in every country's interest, to keep an engagement in these very important areas. At the same time, no woman or girl is truly free if she's not secure. And at this moment, we also need to invest in our own security to make sure that we keep that freedom. So of course, this is a balance to strike. And I believe that as many countries have to make these very difficult decisions, then we should definitely get together and try to find common priorities to make sure that we actually put our money where we see most value.
Minister Bettel, how do you see this challenge being addressed in the future?
You know, I'm also the minister in charge of cooperation. So, as you can guess, but when we had difficult budget times a few years ago, it would have been very popular to cut the cooperation, because people, and very often in my country, populists will say, why should you help someone somewhere else when there are still problems in your own country? But so if you want the best answer to that, it's because they are scared about foreigners, they are scared about they don't know, etc., etc. I told them, you know, for example, climate change. We need to help climate change. We need to help poverty. We need to give education. And when we say about the climate change, and people say, yeah, but you know, with this development, you won't help. I said, you know, you are scared today because you see migrants coming. That's what you tell me. Imagine, these are war refugees. These are political refugees. But tomorrow you will have millions of climate refugees. So we need to do something. Then they fully agree. They say, do more. So sometimes you have to do psychology to tell to people that the investment in other places in the world are in the interest of all of us. Because if you don't give hope to young people, especially now I look in the Sahel or in other regions, where there are terrorist groups, they will have just maybe no alternative, no education, no possibility to find something else. And we still are one of the very few countries in the world to have 1% in cooperation. And so that still means that I have 99% at home. And to give 1% to give education, it's said that in 2025, still this year, depending on the country you were born, the religion you have, if you are a woman or a girl, if you are straight or gay, if you are black, white, if you are Jewish, Catholic, or Buddhist, that your rights are not the same. And so for us, it's important also in the cooperation, as a new condition that I have as Minister of Cooperation, is that I don't want to impose in the countries rules that would be changing for them this way of life. But I don't want backlashes. If a woman is not allowed to go in Afghanistan in school tomorrow, I won't work with the Afghan government. If a people is not allowed to do his religion tomorrow, to practice a religion where he was allowed yesterday, I'm not going to work with that country. if a minority is going to be ban of rights tomorrow where it was possible today, I won't work with this. So I think that 1% to give also to the weakest in some countries hope, perspective, and as I said, not to fish, but to learn and the material how to fish is the best invest. And I think that it's not popular. I tell you it's not popular, and I understand a lot of governments do it. Now the last government decided in one country to cut 25%, some is 60%, but to invest 1%, when we are sometimes discussing if we want to eat hot and cold, we should not forget that in a lot of countries, people would be happy to have something on the plate to eat some days a week. We should not forget that. Solidarity is not a must. It's a question also of international responsibility.
Thank you for this. That's a powerful message. Minister Bettel, looking to the future, in what ways can Europe leverage its technological innovation and digital expertise to enhance its global influence?
So the first thing is that we need to take barriers away. And we think global, but we act local. When you see Apple is American, Samsung is Korean. To my Swedish neighbor, don't take it personally, Nokia was a fantastic brand from the North countries.
Well, Ericsson is now.
Ericsson, Nokia and Ericsson, sorry. But now, when you go in a shop, you choose between Asia and America. When I go on internet, I have Google, which is American. I have Yahoo. I order things on Amazon. I order things on Alibaba, Alipay, or Temu. So where are the Europeans? So we have 27 regulations, 27 legislations, and for small companies, if you want to be a successful company in Europe, you need to be present and to be compliant in these 27 countries. So it is really this single market we're speaking about. We need to take these barriers away, and we need also to have a change in mind. In Bezos, he did 3 bankruptcies before being the boss of Amazon. Very often in our mind, I don't know how it's here in India, but if I do bankruptcy, if my company is collapsing, I'm banned. I'm the one who failed. Instead of thinking, he took the risk, maybe this time was not the right one, but the next time will be the next and the good one. So we need also to have this change in mind I always said as a prime minister, I'm not the one who will give you the bed to sleep, but to give you the trampoline to jump. And this is how we should also in Europe have more this initiative to support and have respect of failure and not the exclusion of the one who failed.
Mr. Baliu, would you like to add anything before moving to the audience?
Well, I completely agree on the reduction of internal barriers within the internal market. It's been quantified at 45% tariff on goods. So it's worse than most of the tariffs that are being now debated in the US. And it's 110% on services. So that's a huge handicap for our companies, and that doesn't let us maximize the benefits of the common market. But I have to say, and I was before with some people from think tanks, and I've noticed a tone of pessimism about Europe at the conference. And it's true that the economy, Spain is doing well, but the overall economy is not very good. And I have to say that we have all the fundamentals there to be, I mean, we are a major player already, and then we have all the fundamentals to catch the trend. I mean, the trains that don't leave the station forever. We had US leading AI, and everyone was lagging behind very far. Then we had China with DeepSeek, and AI was too expensive. Now we have a French company with AI. So things are moving very quickly. What this means is not that you get left behind, but you can always have the opportunity to jump on the train. And I'm convinced if we make the right choices, like reducing these internal barriers, investing in R&D, etc., and we make the right choices at the political level, both in Brussels and nationally, I think we will catch up quite quickly.
Let's go.
I just want to touch on something that we haven't touched upon, and I think it is critical. It is the fact that as Europeans, we don't think long-term, and we don't have a strategy. And that stands in stark contrast to China, which has a strategy all the way to 2049. and Russia, which we know from a purely, not just military, but actually collectively, economy, military, etc., diplomatic, has a strategy all the way to 2035 and a clear objective for what it wants to achieve by this point. Whereas I think, and again, it differs between European states, but I think that as Europeans, we've been guilty of an ahistoric understanding of history. We thought for a long time, tomorrow will probably be a lot like today, also in security terms. And even now, I see us thinking primarily Ukraine. It's like there's a mental block. We cannot think further than this war and how it ends. But even when it ends, the future continues. Russia will continue, and I would invite everybody to think beyond the possible attack on a Baltic state, because that's where the immediate European thinking goes, and develop a strategic long-term outlook for the next, I would say, 15 years. Who do we want to be as Europe in the world by 2040? And I think that's a debate we're currently not having for all the good reasons, because we're busy thinking about other stuff, but the others are thinking long-term. So we also have to do the same.
With that, we will move to the audience.
I have a question from the right. Yeah.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. This is Ayush Pal. I'm a diplomatic correspondent from Samvad World. I have a question to the panel that Europe over the last 3 to 4 years have gone through a massive transition. And it all started from Brexit happening, which eventually happened on the last day of 2020. And then it led up to Angela Merkel, who has been the queen of Europe, as they say, for the last 16 years. She entered Berlin in 2006. She left in an Audi car in 2021. And then the Ukrainian war happened. There's a successive tremors that has happened into Europe. So has it led to a leadership crisis in the European continent, or in the another terms, has it strengthened the leadership? Thank you.
Who would like to answer this question?
I can take it.
Me? Yes.
Please.
Well, I feel a little lack of confidence here in the panel. I think that Europe has grown stronger from every crisis it has gone through, and we have shown in the pandemic, after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and even after Brexit, that we can get together and become even stronger. After Brexit, people thought that several countries would leave. They didn't. Now we have more countries knocking on the door, wanting to become a part of the biggest single market in the world, trading freely with 80 countries around the world. And like I said initially, I think we have to go back to basics, and that is focusing on the free market, not on state-driven projects, not even in defense, but promote fair markets, competitiveness, and invest in education. And I mean, I'm from Sweden. Sweden is like the poster child of Mario Draghi. We are the second most innovative country in the world. We have created companies such as Spotify, Ericsson, like I mentioned, Tetra Pak, IKEA. We have invented Bluetooth. And I am so convinced that Europe can grow even stronger. And that is with, like I mentioned several times, free trade. And I look forward to having free trade with India. Thank you.
Sure. Please, go ahead.
I just want, first I say Ericsson, so I don't forget it. Just to give an answer also to this question. The fact is that in Europe, we have a president of the Commission, we have a president of the Council, then we have every 6 months a president of the European presidency, and then we have a high representative. So we should think maybe once, if during the European elections every 5 years, we shouldn't have the opportunity to have all transnational lists, because for the moment everybody's voting just for the parties in his own country. So to have a transnational list where the one of this transnational list with the most votes could be the one to be the candidate for the president of the Commission. So you will have really someone with also the legitimacy from the electors. I'm just thinking. Or that you have a second vote where you vote for the president of the Council for 5 years. And so it will be the president of Europe. This is one of the possibilities we could have, because for the moment, it is sometimes difficult to explain to people. But as Maria said, we did great, and we have more people who want to join the European Union than countries who want to leave. And believe me, if the Brits would have to decide again, we would see.
All right. We will take a question from the Raisina Young Fellows. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Christopher Alcuri from Italy. My question is related to Ukraine, and not because of a mental block, but to learn to to touch on the lessons learned, basically. So since the Russian intervention in Ukraine, so in 2014 till 2022, we saw a very weak and inconsistent European Union reaction. Is the European Union today more prepared to prevent a similar situation in the future? Because probably it led to where we are now. With prevention, we would be in another place, probably. And is the inclusion of nations in NATO the only solution to deter Russia or any future aggressor? Thank you.
Go ahead, Ms. Go.
I think your question echoes the previous one, and I will say I don't agree that and say this as a NATO official, but I don't think the EU was weak and divided. I think, in fact, that Russia did not expect the EU to answer as strongly and as united as it did, both in political terms, when you look at granting candidate status, but also in military terms. And I will argue even in diplomatic language terms. The EU is famous for using very polite language. And, well, 3 years ago, it discovered it can also speak in a different way. So I think I will not share the assessment that the EU was weakened.
Sorry to interrupt. I meant 2014, not 2014.
Oh, 2014. Well, in 2014, it clearly didn't react as in 2022. But I will say, and I think this is also echoes what the minister said earlier, with every crisis, and that's what's interesting about political crises, actually, is that you grow stronger and stronger. So could we prevent another 2014? But in the sense that we acted very strongly in 22, that shows you that, well, prevention of territorial annexation of a neighboring state that's not a member of the EU or NATO is going to be, by definition, hard. And I would say that Ukraine is the example that we're all talking about today, but there's many other instances in the world in the last 20 years where the law was broken in conflict terms and there was nothing the EU could do about it. I also think that the EU, neither the EU nor NATO, is the policeman of the world, is not responsible, but out of solidarity and geographic proximity, I think it was the right thing to do. So I will say we're definitely in a better position. And I also think that 22 was prepared by 2014. So it's not like between 14 and 22, nothing happened. You can see a shift in insights, but also in spending and defense structures beginning in 2014. So I would say we cannot compare today to more than 10 years ago. I think the world has changed, the mindset has changed. So I think we have learned from the crisis, but the next crisis is always around the corner.
Minister Brekelman.
Yeah, I think we are in a better position now than we were in 2014-15, but we are still risking to fall in the same trap if there is a peace agreement, because it would be very easy for Europe to push the snooze button again and to continue normal life. If you look at the intentions of Putin, we know what his imperialistic ambitions are. We know that it goes further and it goes beyond the current ceasefire or the current front line in Ukraine. It goes also further than only Ukraine. It's also the Baltic states and other former Soviet states. Second, if you look at the production of Russia, the military production, not only now, but also the projections for the upcoming years, it's only going up. And why is that? It's not only because Ukraine. It's because they want to be able to show their military force also in other parts of Europe. And third, Russia has transitioned to a war economy. And now to go back to a normal economy and to have hundreds of thousands of soldiers who had like the most terrible war experience go back in your society, I think that would have a very bad effect on the Russian society. So Putin has the intention, has the capabilities, and has the interest to prolong his aggression in the future. And our intelligence agencies estimated that it would take Russia slightly over a year to redistribute and reallocate its forces along the NATO border. So just imagine that there would be a ceasefire over the course of this year, and then it would take Russia a year to move hundreds of thousands of troops to the border with NATO, to the border with the Baltic states. Can you imagine if they do a large military exercise there of 200,000 to 300,000 people, how much panic that would create in the Baltic states and in the rest of Europe? And we know from our experience with Ukraine that we only know 1 week in advance if it's just a large military exercise or it's the preparation for a large-scale attack. So we need to be aware of this scenario. This is not an unlikely scenario. The only way that we can make it unlikely is if we make sure that our defense and our deterrence is in order. And we need to act now, because we do not have much time. And that's why we need to invest much more in our defense. We need to produce much more. And we need to make sure that over the next couple of years, we keep our deterrence power in place, not only in Ukraine, but also in the Baltic states and along the NATO border. Because otherwise, I can imagine that we will be sitting here in 5 to 10 years, and that we will come to the conclusion that we made the same mistake twice as Europe, and we should prevent that at all costs.
Unfortunately, we won't be able to take any other questions because our time is up, and we need to wrap up with this closing question for all our panelists. While Ukraine remains at the center of Europe's security concerns, instability in other regions, from the Middle East to the Indo-Pacific, also has direct implications for European security. I myself come from the Middle East. We are today in India, and these discussions are taking center stage. The question is Europe maintaining a global security outlook, or is Ukraine consuming all the strategic attention? Minister Batel, in a few words, please.
Shortly. So the first thing is, it's not only Europe. It's not only Europe, it's burning everywhere. It's in Africa, we have in the Sahel, we have in Congo, Rwanda, we have Eritrea, we have Sudan. I could make a list of countries where it's burning for the moment. So I think what would be the most important thing is also that international rules are respected. People don't care. We have the UN, they are dog without teeth. They bark, but they don't bite. And so it would be important that we have international law respected and international regulations, and that we stop to speak about each other, but we speak to each other, and that we have international bodies that works. For the moment, the multilateralism is on crisis. And believe me, if this crisis doesn't finish, it won't be a happy ending. So I really hope that Europe has a role, but not only Europe. And I just want to remind that these 5 countries which are in the Security Council are there because they were the peacemaker, not the troublemaker.
Thank you very much. Minister Stannergaard.
Well, if anything, the unlawful war on Ukraine has shown how important it is to collaborate with other countries, regardless of where they're situated in the world, to stand up for the rules-based world order. And that is being challenged not only in Ukraine, but also in the Baltic Sea and in South China Sea. And security is so closely interlinked all over the world, and therefore we also have to cooperate with countries all over the world. I mean, the most obvious example is that North Korea is sending troops to fight on the Russian side. And that is the reason why the EU is looking at increasing its cooperation with countries, like-minded countries around the world. And that is why Sweden has adopted a defense cooperation policy for the Pacifics. And so I definitely believe that democracies now need to stand together and stand up for what is right. And it is also a European obligation to do so all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister Brekelmans.
Yeah, I very much agree. And if I can build on that, you know, India is the biggest democracy in the world. The EU is the second biggest. So I think we share a lot of the same values. Second, I think if you look at our interest, security very much interconnected, but also if you look at the Netherlands, for example, we are a trading nation. Freedom of navigation at sea is key for us. Same is true for India. And we all benefit from international law and for making sure that more aggressive powers are not violating this. These are just a few examples, but there are many more in which we have same values, same interests, share the same principles. And I think there are so many opportunities to work together. Over the last 2 days, I had discussions about the defense industry. I think if you look at our technology and innovation, there are so many synergies, but also a country like India can bring the scale that we as a smaller country like the Netherlands need, or that Europe sometimes need. We need to ramp up our production massively. So let's work on these opportunities, let's explore that, and let's make sure that we keep in mind that we share the same values, same principles, and that we share the same interest. And then I think together we can be a force of good in this polarizing and this sometimes dangerous world.
Thank you. Mr. Belliou.
Thank you. First, you said we were concentrating too much on Ukraine, and of course it's consuming many resources, but I would say that first of all, supporting Ukraine is the best security guarantee for Europe. As the Dutch colleague said, once they free up their resources in Ukraine, then other things become possible. And secondly, I would say, and this is a more general concern, is the best guarantee for the principles of the UN Charter, which is self-determination of peoples, sovereignty, territorial integrity. If we set the precedent that you can invade your neighbor and take away its territory after a brutal war, then we're going to very ugly places in the world. So that's first. And secondly, on engagement. We are engaging, and well, I see that there are several members of the Foreign Affairs Council today in Raisina, and there was a Foreign Affairs Council yesterday, and they weren't there because they're here, so they're engaging with India, which is a very important country. We are engaging with the Middle East. In the case of Spain, we recognized the state of Palestine on May last year, along with other European partners, and we are pushing for a two-state solution in the Middle East. We're engaging more with Africa. We are putting a special focus on Western Africa, which is our territorial neighborhood. And last, but certainly not least, we are pushing for closer relations between the European Union and Latin America for the Mercosur agreement, which will be the largest trade agreement in the world. So, of course, there's much more focus now in the East than there used to be, but we are engaging elsewhere as well.
Thank you. Let's go.
So, in the NATO Defense College where I work, I would say NATO in general, we have a whole informal network thinking about the future, because I think that's ultimately what you're asking, is what's going to happen next, or are we aware of everything else that's going on? And we do see very clearly that while the headlines are very much focused on Ukraine, in our analysis, it's a very rich discussion going on everything relating to ranging from how climate change will impact security, and I'm not talking about migration, I'm actually talking about how climate change can affect, I don't know, submarines, weapon system. We're looking at the Arctic, we're looking at Russia in the Arctic, we're looking, of course, at Africa, at the Middle East. So I'm going to say that from an analytical point of view, the tools are pretty sophisticated. The awareness is there when we're looking at what-if scenarios that we publish every year. I think it's much more diverse. But of course, you know, as we just heard, it's obvious that Ukraine, due to its being at the epicenter of European security when it comes to the East, plays a very, very important role. But I will say, maybe that's reassuring for some in the audience, that the thinking goes a lot further.
Thank you very much. Very insightful, very interesting. Thank you all, and thank you everyone for attending.